Alison, can you tell me how Brian got involved in covering wars for the BBC?
He was freelancing first, and because he worked for Persian television for a while, and he was freelancing, he was doing news nights and so on. And then the first time he was in Afghanistan, that was as a freelance, I think. He wasn't staff, certainly. And that was the first time he was shot at. And he came home, and I told him I was pregnant with our second daughter. And he said, well, I'll never do it again. I won't, you know. And of course he did. And he was then with the Mujahideen, who became Al-Qaeda, I suppose. But he was with them while the Russians were shooting them. And that's how it began, I don't know.
Well, Brian was one of the finest cameramen of his generation, not just in the BBC, but across all the news networks. He really was a light that shone very, very brightly. He worked in some really difficult and dangerous situations, but he always had a calm authority. He was unflustered because he knew exactly the kind of pictures that he wanted to get, and he set about his work quietly, diligently, but with great enthusiasm. And as well as being an absolutely brilliant, fabulous cameraman, he was a wonderful colleague, and everybody in the BBC misses him hugely.
Brian was a joy, an honour and a pleasure to work with. He was unflappable, he was brave, his images were always perfectly composed. Here's an example from an early stage of the siege of Sarajevo in May 1992. Brian Hulse was the main man in the team.
The Battle of Sarajevo, the clash the city had been dreading between the Federal Army and mainly Muslim forces loyal to the Bosnian government. Vehicles and buildings in flames and fierce exchanges of gunfire across the city centre. The start of it was confused and disputed. Each side accused the other of firing first near an army building in the city centre. We came upon the Muslims early, retreating to safer positions to exchange fire with army snipers. The Bosnians called on the army to surrender, but it was a vain hope, for the defending side had the small guns and the attacking side the big ones. Mortar and, we think, tank rounds rained in on the city centre. Many buildings were damaged, civilians fled, and the battle intensified. The defenders placed a box of high explosives in the road to be detonated if the tanks tried to come through. It is the first time that the war has come like this to the very centre of Sarajevo. Those who remain in the city are trapped, unable to get out, and awaiting the next assault. By this evening, the fighting was inconclusive but catastrophic. Parts of the city lay in ruins. Appeals for a ceasefire had not been heeded, and the worst that could have happened is happening.
We reporters competed with each other, all to have the honour of working with Brian Hulse. And we did it all over the world. Here's another example of his work at sea with the American Navy after the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait in 1990.
A war drill at sea in waters crowded with the navies of the world. But the Americans predominate, with 2 battle groups in the area and another 2 at hand. This one led by a floating fortress, the battleship Wisconsin. Its 16-inch guns date from World War II, its Harpoon and Tomahawk cruise missiles from its refit 3.5 years ago. It has a statement to make.
We're an impact type of a ship. You know, we're kind of a bunker down here, you might say. A case-hardened bunker. Our hull is 16.5 inches thick. We have all these weapons sitting down here. So if we're needed, we're ready.
And getting ready, they're the only force firing live rounds. The Phalanx system for use against missiles and the 5-inch gun against surface targets. This ship is in a state of permanent maximum readiness, a necessity in these waters, but its role is more than defensive. The Americans believe that simply by being here, it is a floating threat to the Iraqis in Kuwait.
Center gun, 1 round, load!
The 16-inch gun can reach 23 miles inland. But what if there are hostages in the target zone?
I don't want to shoot Americans any more than anybody else done, but I'm here to do what I'm directed to do, and it won't change a thing.
A veteran of 2 wars, World War II and Korea, the Wisconsin is battle-ready for another.
Brian was also a thoroughly fine human being, a family man, an honour to know, and he left us far too soon.
War correspondents, and I know one quite well, they sometimes talk about a kind of addiction to it.
Yeah, I think there is definitely that factor. The feeling people in London must have had during the Blitz, which I think must be quite intoxicating in a way. But Brian always did. I mean, he'd have made a lot more money if he'd stayed away, but he came home in between jobs and assignments, and so he lost money because he wasn't building up a... but he always came home in between.
How did he feel about the misery of it? Did that affect him a lot? I mean,
It did. I mean, when Michael Burke first did his Ethiopian famine, and he did his news stories first, and they absolutely shocked this country, well, the world. And then Brian went back as a panorama to do a panorama on it, which was even probably worse. And he came back from that shell-shocked. And I can remember Maddie being about, I don't know, 6, 7, and saying, "Oh, Daddy, you know, this is my new Barbie, this is my doll, you know, blah, blah." And he just couldn't cope with it. But he had to, because he had to adapt his life to us, not the other way around.
did he feel the danger of being in war zones?
Yeah, but he was very careful. I mean, in Kenya once, there was some big explosions which killed a BBC cameraman's sound man. And Brian was also there. You know, there must have been 2 crews. Brian did his shooting from the top of a big block of flats. You know, he got close in and probably got better shots, but he didn't get up close to get killed. He wasn't stupid. But on the other hand, he was in Mostar, and he took risks. Yeah, no doubt.
My dear friend Brian Hulls, my mentor, my colleague, but a very good friend, a very good mate of mine. We spent 3, 4, 5 years together in the early 90s. He'd come from a freelance background, I'd come from an editing background, and we were teamed together as one of the first shoot edits, combining all sorts of skills together in one small 2-person team. And we just gelled immediately. It was our love of photography, I think, in a broader sense, that kept us together, kept us so friendly. We were constantly discussing ways of doing things, ways of filming. We covered so many conflict zones, particularly in Bosnia. Went there so many times. And along with our cameras, and in my case, my sound recording equipment, we used to rattle around with our body armor, but stills cameras round our necks. We were constantly taking pictures, constantly talking about shots. When we were back in London, Brian wasn't really interested in filming outside the Old Bailey or the High Court. And that was my opportunity to learn my skill of camera work. Brian just standing in the background, making sure I was doing things correctly, which was great for me. I'd often be there learning the camera craft, but also the road craft, as I used to call it, where I was pushing and shoving with all the photographers outside the High Court, as well as places like Bosnia, and that conflict we covered extensively. We also went all over Russia. I remember doing one trip with him where we started in Moscow and then travelled the whole width of the country all the way to the Far East in Vladivostok, doing a documentary. But that was our relationship to some extent. We would do some news work in Bosnia a lot, in Mostar, in all sorts of places over that country, over the former Yugoslavia. But then I would take Brian to the Current Affairs Centre of the BBC, where I had lots of contacts. I'd been there for 10, 15 years by then. And we would go off on our little, what we called marketing tours. And I would get him and I jobs with, say, Panorama or 40-minute current affairs programmes. So it was a wonderful team, a wonderful dynamic between the pair of us. Even now when I'm filming, particularly in this new job, being the cameraman to The King and the Queen, I often think about how would Brian film this? How would Brian film that? My style of filming is very much still Brian's style, which is using a longer lens, getting tighter shots. So his influence is still with me.
Did you get the sense that he was ever frightened, or was it because he was working that it was, and he was professional about the risks?
Yeah, and I didn't ever get the feeling he was frightened. But, I mean, the worst time, of course, for me and the family was Baghdad, because there was this huge build-up about we were going to bomb them, and we didn't know about cruise missiles then. Certainly nothing went round corners until actually Brian filmed one. And that was horrible, but he got out the next night. So we did bomb them. I didn't know he was underneath the What's It Hotel, and everybody knew that. And the cruise missiles were avoiding it. I can't remember the name of the hotel now. And he got out the next day. He spent $10,000, hired 3 taxis, got out a lot of people who wanted to get out, who had families and things like that, and didn't want to be just bombed to hell by the Americans and us. And he went, 200 miles across the desert, huge risk, but then went back in again 2 weeks later into the fighting.
And he spent a lot of time in Bosnia, in Sarajevo, and during the...
Mostar was the worst. I mean, he was arrested in Srebrenica. I've got the name right, haven't I? He was arrested, and so was Maggie O'Kane, by the Serbs after the massacre at Srebrenica. But I think the worst time in Bosnia was Mostar, when he and Jeremy Bowen were 3 weeks stuck using puddles for cleaning their teeth, and no food, nothing at all, and hardly any contact. And I think that might be the film he was most proud of.
And I hadn't realised that he was at Srebrenica at the time of the massacre.
He was arrested, so I mean it was actually big news in the papers and so on. And Tony Hall, I think, rang me and sort of got the world at one, about to start, and he rang just as you were just about to hear on the news. Yeah. But they kept him for 3 days or something, and then let him go.
And this was because he was trying to film what was happening at the camp, where they were taking people off in truckloads to be shot.
Yeah, 8,000 people, men, were massacred. Yeah.
How do you have a sense of how these things like Srebrenica affected him personally?
No, because Brian was quite a quiet man. He did keep things to himself. He wasn't chatty. No, and I can remember. Do you remember Fallujah, which is where?
Yes.
What's his name? Gassed a whole village, didn't he, or anything? And Brian was there, and he filmed there, and then he was up in the mountains where it was snowy and there was no food and nothing else with the refugees. And I can remember once having these great big phones that we used to have, these sat phones. I can remember ringing him and having a conversation about the orthodontist, and he was on the top of this mountain with all these starving refugees. And we had to try and live life normally. Yeah.
You've led me quite naturally onto the next topic I wanted to look into, which was, how was it for you and your daughters while Brian was away on these sometimes very dangerous trips?
I think the only time they were really aware was Baghdad, because it was so on the news that we were going to bomb them all, and that we knew he was in the middle of it. But generally, no, the children, I mean, Maddie was 11 when he died. Paul's 16, it hit her a lot hard. No, we just kept going. I was, running a newspaper, I was very busy and they were busy at school. But yes, I sometimes used to think, oh my God, I wish I'd married a solicitor or somebody who'd be home and, you know.
And of course, we do now take communications and ease of communications for granted much more, but we're talking 20 plus years ago, and it was must have been a great deal harder to stay in touch.
Well, 30, yes. I mean, I can remember he was in the Philippines for a long time once, filming for Persian television, and there was a typhoon, he nearly drowned, and I didn't hear about it till I got a postcard.
People of substance don't need to make a great fuss, do they, when they first introduce themselves to you? And Brian was a person of substance. I think he hardly spoke the first time we met, and we had one of those long car journeys that you often have when you're a newly meeting television team in a difficult place. We were in Bosnia, and he didn't speak a lot, but he wasn't taciturn. But it became increasingly obvious to me during that journey and in subsequent days that this was a man of enormous humanity, a man of real substance, a man who knew how to do things professionally, but also really crucially, and this informed all of his work, a genuinely humane person who saw it as his job to bring to the screens of Britain the things happening around the world that he saw. So he was professional, he was kindly, he was also, and it's difficult to know how this is quite captured in camera work, but he was enormously humorous. And as I got to know him better, and as he brought me on, as it were, because I was still very young and doing this job, you could see in him, you could hear in him a warmth and humour too. And somehow to me, a lot of his best work is the work of someone who's properly humane, who has a sense of the disasters of humanity, but also of the funny little things that go on. So the piece you're going to see is a very short piece from Bosnia. You see the stillness of some of his shots with a lot happening in them, but he apparently effortlessly capturing those things. So he was an enormous loss, but my goodness, he really shone brightly when he was here, and I certainly miss him.
These were moments of triumph as the first vehicles of the convoy nosed through the gathering gloom into safe territory, a victory for courage and perseverance amid so much misery. The road had been shelled only hours before, but the firing had stopped completely by the time the lorries arrived. 684 women and children had made it against all the odds to the outskirts of Tuzla. This is a colossal achievement for all the aid workers involved, but they know better than anyone else that there is a great task still ahead. But as the lorries gathered pace and entered Tuzla tonight, all the attention and all the emotion was focused on the achievement of the last 2 days. The transfer off the vehicles was as smooth as it could be in the circumstances. Those who could took the final steps of this journey on foot, shepherded into a converted sports hall which is now home. Young and old will sleep in safety tonight for the first time in many months. With so much suffering and so many people in desperate need of help, there is no time to lose.
The other topic I said we'd like to explore is just to get some sense of someone who had a very exciting and distinguished career, but also had a life here in the Black Downs. And what did Brian like to do when he wasn't sort of dodging bullets, when he was at home?
He was quite studious in a way. I mean, he had a terrible, because he grew up in Malaya, he didn't have a sort of, and anyway, he ended up going to a secondary modern and didn't have a very good education. So he educated himself, doing things like learning Farsi. And he became quite an intellectual. But he loved, this place. He planted, a whole new orchard when he lived in. He got quite involved in the school. He asked Martin Bell came and did a speech day at Wellington School because he asked him to.
And was life unpredictable in the sense of the phone would ring and he'd be off in his throw?
Yes. And I can remember once, I wasn't living here, I was temporarily living in Cornwall, but he rang up and said, "Oh, I'll be home soon, darling." And 2 minutes later, a helicopter landed in the garden. But the funniest thing he brought back from one of his trips was to Kuwait. Do you remember when all the oil fields were burning? And he brought back 2 melted titanium puddles from an American jet that was shot down. So and one was in here, just as decoration for a while. And I suddenly thought, maybe it's radioactive. Put it in the garage quickly. I never found out, really. Don't know, it's disappeared.
I think you must have been very proud of it.
Oh, at once, absolutely. Yeah. But, you know, you go back to the addiction thing. Yes, they are, I think. I mean, Jeremy's still going. He's had an astonishing career. And John Simpson didn't give up, did he? I mean, he's still going, really. Yeah. And I don't think it's excitement so much. I don't think it's that. Brian used to call it being there. I like being there when it's happening.
I think people like Jeremy Bowen have a very strong sense, and I'm sure Brian, a very strong sense of duty, in a sense, that someone must tell this story.
Well, yes, I was rereading something the other day, and in Mostar, going back to that, someone died on camera. And he's saying, could I have done more? Should I have done more? Should I have dropped the camera? Should I, very difficult, I think, sometimes, and filming dying children. But because of that, we had Live Aid. What it was for? Yeah. Largely because of those programs. So I think it did find that difficult sometimes. It's an interface, isn't it? A camera. It's as a reporter, I once that a helicopter came down near Chard from Yeovilton and it crashed. And I got there before the ambulance and people. I was told. And I couldn't bring myself to take a photograph of this pilot being put on another helicopter to go to hospital. He survived. But I couldn't bring myself because I'm a reporter. I'm not a cameraman. And I cowered it out. I couldn't do it. I didn't have the guts. But he did.